All right. So Melanie already kind of mentioned a lot of the things that are in our opening description, but I'll go ahead and get started. So this manifesto actually starts out with key terms and definitions, some of which were borrowed from a zine called Settler Sexuality on Stolen Land, which was created by members of the Get Info Shop in Window Rock, Arizona. I'm not going to read all the terms and definitions, but just so you're aware, they are there. The Pueblo Feminist Caucus is an official caucus of the Red Nation as of February 2019. The PFC first formed for Pueblo Feminism Rising, a panel during Gallup Pride in 2018. Oh, wait, did you already read all of this?
Yeah, it was in there.
Okay, well, I'm going to... So then the next section is who is the Red Nation? So we just have a brief description. The Red Nation is a grassroots organization of Native and non-Native activists, educators, students, and community organizers dedicated to building a widespread movement for the liberation of Native peoples and all colonized peoples from capitalism and colonialism. We center Native political agendas and struggles through direct action, advocacy, mobilization, and education. We form to address the marginalization and invisibility of Native struggles within mainstream social justice organizing, and to foreground the targeted destruction and violence towards Native life and land. And I'll just go through the next part, because it was short. The PFC serves as a political caucus within the Red Nation. Our purpose is to create a movement that specifically addresses the distinct ways heteropatriarchy, colonialism, individualism, capitalism, racism, ableism, and weaponized religion has manifested in Pueblo communities. We do this through organizing that includes historical research and analysis, community education, and mobilizing direct action and advocacy. All of the institutions named are those which seek to eliminate us completely, so we call for their abolition. The purpose of this caucus is in accordance with the Red Nation's principles of unity and mission, and of course, Pueblo cultural core values. While Pueblo feminism is unique in having resulted from specific political, cultural, and religious structures imposed by the colonization and occupation of Spanish, Mexican, and United States governments, the PFC movement is also realized as belonging to and aligning with traditions of indigenous feminisms, women of color feminisms, black feminist traditions, Marxist feminism, feminism in the third world, and indigenista theory. We understand the politics of this caucus as rooted in the revolutionary feminist traditions that have long served colonized people. So by no means are we seeing this as something new, unique, or spontaneous. We seek to build broad struggle among all colonized people, but center Pueblo people in acknowledgement that the misogynistic violence stemming from a distortion of history leads our communities to adopt institutions of heteropatriarchy, capitalism, and weaponized tradition as traditional. This creates particularly hostile conditions for Pueblo women and LGBTQ plus folks. We aim to organize and educate all those seeking freedom from the violence of heteropatriarchy, capitalism, settler colonialism, white supremacy, etc., and strive toward truly honoring traditional Pueblo governance structures by restoring a balance of power among all genders that enables collaborative and cooperative development for a life-affirming world for ourselves and all our relations of the earth. We look beyond the constraints of neoliberalism and instead look toward the pre-colonial structures of governance and economics that fundamentally oppose capitalism in all of its manifestations. We work in this caucus to dismantle toxic systems and build power, infrastructure, and community to turn back the tides of destruction that diminish our sacred way of life as Pueblo people.
Next section is the name. What does Pueblo, Puebla, Pueblx mean? With our feminist politics in mind, we propose to contest the term Pueblo, which has been imposed upon us by Spanish colonial settlers to describe a vast number of nations with distinct languages and cultural values. As we encourage the use of our own terms for our nations and linguistic groups, we understand that Pueblo has been adopted and embraced by our nations, communities, and individuals to signify our understanding of the power in referring to ourselves as a collective people. We seek to challenge the masculinized term Pueblo by taking into consideration the use of the feminine term Puebla as used by relatives in various regions throughout Mexico. We also seek to consider making the term void of gendering as seen with the terms Chicanx, Latinx, Filipinx. Currently, many other movements seek to degender Latin languages that are typically gendered languages. This is a step toward deconstructing the gender binary and ensuring the language we use is always inclusive of our gender nonconforming relatives. We include the word feminist in the title of our caucus to indicate our mission to create a Pueblo liberation movement that must be inherently feminist in nature, meaning it must center femmes, LGBTQ2+, and gender nonconforming people to be liberatory at all.
Beginning of the 6-point program. Number 1, the end of heteropatriarchal violence. European settlement depended on the dissolving of indigenous governance structures to assert authority. For this reason, violence upon queer and feminine bodies was used as a primary tactic for the obliteration of indigenous governance structures. Because indigenous bodies stand in the way of access to the land, and because women are seen as the producers of native nations through the European heteropatriarchal lens, violence against women, particularly sexual violence, is used as means of separating native people from the land. Women and queer individuals, especially when in positions of power, become the biggest threat to settler projects of dispossession. Sexual violence is such an effective tool of conquest because of the overwhelming damage it inflicts upon families, lasting for generations, and instilling shame and humiliation that discourages any efforts to resist. We demand an end to the perpetuation of sexist, transphobic, and homophobic violence and machismo culture within our communities. We demand safety and respect for all Pueblo, Puebla, Pueblx women and LGBTQ two-spirit plus individuals. We demand an end to all sexual abuse, physical abuse, spiritual abuse, and psychological abuse enacted upon all Pueblo, Puebla, Pueblx people.
Number 2, the end of excommunication and disenrollment on the basis of blood quantum. The infamous Indian killer Andrew Jackson suggested that the intermarriage between white settlers and native women would result in the assimilation of native peoples and thus the assimilation of native lands. The idea that whiteness could somehow overpower dilute indigeneity on a biological level is what led to the creation of the blood quantum system. A system also crafted to place indigenous people on an inevitable trajectory toward total disappearance. With the Indian Reorganization Act of 1934, blood quantum laws were applied to all native nations and had to be met in order to maintain federal recognition. This required that all citizens of a native nation met the blood quantum criteria of at least 1/4 Indian blood. We know that our tribes depend on maintaining blood quantum to continue receiving federal benefits that are vital. However, continued participation in the eradication of our own nations will never be beneficial to our continuance as Pueblo people. Historically, practices such as the naming of infants and various rites marking coming of age determine belonging and citizenship for Native people. For Pueblo people specifically, matrilineal kinship structures determined affiliation. We demand an end to self-elimination via excommunication and disenrollment of Pueblo people on the basis of blood quantum. Blood quantum is contradictory to Pueblo notions of kinship, clanship, belonging, and identity that are traditionally situated by matrilineality. We have long shared lineage with surrounding tribes prior to colonization. This did not diminish our ties to our nations. Ultimately, cultural participation and contributions to our families and community affirm belonging.
Number 3. Please excuse me, I'm losing my voice. Normally I'm really loud. Number 3. We demand an end to the weaponization of religion and toxic traditionalism. Critiques of traditionalism have already been articulated by indigenous feminists. We are using the term toxic traditionalism to specifically describe stagnant values that have been woven into our culture as a result of colonialism and deliberate colonial tactics used to obstruct our way of life in order for us to submit to settler occupiers.
We often keep those traditions simply because they have become traditions, not because they serve us and our core values. We can also look at toxic traditionalism as the distortion and weaponization of tradition and how we use those tactics on ourselves. We emphasize that toxic traditionalism does not apply to all traditions or the sacred and ceremonial. The normalization of sexist violence is often conflated with tradition and even accepted as unchangeable or even on the par with Pueblo core values. PFC seeks to provide counter-narratives to the normalization of sexist violence, citing the same core values and oral histories that are wielded against marginalized Pueblo people. Toxic traditionalism further erases women, LGBTQ, Two-Spirit Plus, and our gender non-conforming relatives by keeping them in submissive positions within our communities and prioritizing the voices and opinions of only cisgender heterosexual men. Toxic traditionalism aims to silence any opinions or views that are contradictory to it. Through toxic traditionalism and the weaponization of religions, some individuals in positions of power abuse certain aspects of traditional and sacred knowledge by keeping it to themselves and shaming those who don't or haven't had access to the same knowledge simply because they don't fit in the cisgender heterosexual male identity. This keeps an oppressive power imbalance in place. We demand the end to use of toxic traditionalism and the weaponized religion. We demand that the voices of our women, LGBTQ, Two-Spirit Plus, and gender non-conforming relatives be heard and their liberation be at the forefront of our liberation as Native peoples.
4. The end of the exploitation of Pueblo culture and sacred knowledge and objects. For generations, Pueblo people have been dependent on the Indian art and tourism industry for basic income. Though the art and culture of Pueblo people should continue to be celebrated, these industries are notorious for their exploitative practices. From the theft of sacred objects to the divulging of sacred knowledge and the mistreatment of native artisans. These industries profit off our labor while commodifying our culture. Yet Pueblo people suffer from some of the worst rates of poverty, while the elite who consume native art and control these industries live in luxury on Pueblo lands. We demand an end to the exploitation of Pueblo culture, people, and sacred objects. We demand that sacred objects and items be repatriated and that native artist laborers no longer be exploited.
Number 5, we demand an end to the glorification of the genocide of Pueblo people. Pueblo people are constantly reminded of their genocide through revisionist history, colonial imagery, and celebrations that glorify our conquests by the Spanish crown and U.S. empire. We have continually resisted the erasure of Pueblx resistance to conquest and fought to have our history accurately taught in educational institutions. Presently, statues of Spanish and U.S. colonizers are proudly displayed. Our lands and sacred sites still bear names paying homage to conquest, and educational texts at all levels of academia remain inaccurate, incomplete, and blatantly revised. These are not simply symbolic issues nor issues of representation. They reflect the very real ongoing climate of violence against indigenous people. We demand that all racist imagery and celebrations of conquest and colonization be abolished. We demand an end to all narratives ignoring the ongoing violence against Pueblx people in all its forms. We call for the installation of an accurate Pueblo-driven curriculum to replace the revisionist history curriculum at all levels of public and private academic institutions. We demand that Pueblo students have access to culturally curriculum and language classes.
Number 6, we demand an end to land loss at the hands of corporate and settler interest. Popular tourist sites such as Ojo Caliente Hot Springs and the city of Los Alamos sit atop some of the most sacred locations to Tewa people. Likewise, the development of resorts and campsites in the Jemez Mountains, Santa Fe Mountains serve a primarily white upper-class base. Not only does the presence of popular tourism sites disrupt our relationship to the land by decreasing ancestral hunting and gathering grounds, the communities that are most impacted seldom see significant revenue from these tourist attractions. Los Alamos National Labs and the presence of the Jack Pile uranium mine in Laguna, Pueblo are examples of some of the first sites of the nuclear industrial complex and continue the project of the militarization of Pueblo lands. Los Alamos is not only a tourist site, it is first and foremost a site of military occupation and continues to exist as such. It is a disturbing irony that among one of the holiest places in the Tewa world, the most deadly weapon in all of human history was created. The devastation of the nuclear bomb began not in Japan, but right here in New Mexico, with Pueblo peoples as its first victims who still suffer the long-term health impacts of exposure to radioactivity. We demand an end to all projects of resource extraction, militarism, corporate, and settler interests on Pueblo lands.
Pueblo, Puebla, Pueblx, feminism is for everyone. All people suffer from the impacts of heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, settler colonial violence, resource extraction, and the nightmare of capitalism. We are impacted collectively by these systems regardless of gender, sexuality, age, and enrollment status. It is our collective duty to care for and uplift each other by unlearning the ways we might actively uphold these oppressive institutions and educate ourselves about how we can actively dismantle them. Pueblx feminism is for everyone because it puts forth a new theory that can be used as a tool for liberation for all colonized people. By merging our struggle with those of the oppressed around the world, we gain the momentum and power needed to liberate not only Pueblo people, but all our non-human relatives and sacred beings of the earth. For our culture, traditions, languages, and lands to continue to exist, heteropatriarchy, white supremacy, settler colonial violence, resource extraction, and capitalism must die.
Pueblo, Puebla, Pueblx, Feminine Caucus Code of Conduct. At no time during any PFC meeting, event, or action do we condone the speaking of things of a sacred, ceremonial, private, or sensitive matter. We encourage that sharing of traditional knowledge and wisdom within appropriate parameters, as we understand that the nature of patriarchy in Pueblos keeps a power imbalance by denying knowledge to femmes, queer folks, and youth. However, we ask that everyone be aware of the matters they speak of and respect the spiritual boundaries of one another. We pride ourselves in following in the spirit of ethnographic refusal as a part of our feminist praxis. We actively protect sensitive and sacred information by our refusal to engage in outside questioning that prompts us to speak about these topics. At no time during a PFC meeting, event, or action do we condone the speaking of things that do not consider the safety of PFC members and the potential impacts or consequences members may experience as a result of living, working, praying in environments permeated by heteropatriarchy, toxic masculinity, and violence. We ask that all members be conscientious of this at all times they are speaking on behalf of PFC.
So that's our complete manifesto. We've been we've been writing this document for probably close to 8 months now. It's been through a lot of revisions, and it will continue to undergo revisions as time goes on. There's something we wanted to add to it that basically states that as material conditions change, so too will our analysis of them. And meaning, as things change, so too might this manifesto to suit what's actually happening in our everyday lives, what's actually happening in the world. So y'all are the first to hear that.
So before we get before we get into the panel, the panelist remarks, I want to say that this manifesto, I helped to edit it. The Pueblo Feminist Caucus crafted this, and our other Red Nation people helped to write and to edit things, right? So we can make our analysis and our language as strong as possible. So I've been able to sort of read and reflect upon this manifesto and this document for a while now. And it really is, the PFC is making history, not just for New Mexico, what's happening tonight, right? But that this manifesto articulates a vision that is really coming into existence for the first time. And I think that the code of conduct is something that not just PFC members follow, but every event that we do. We also, I think, if I can say this, request and expect the people at our events to also abide by that code of conduct. This work is not easy to do in our communities. As women, we face incredible backlash trying to talk about even basic reproductive justice and gender equality. And so it's really important that that code of conduct is followed. And so I really appreciate that you read it tonight.